Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Sechesh Shkolim Daf Vav contains two Mishnayos. In fact, the daf is neatly divided in half by the Mishnayos. Each Amud begins with a Mishnah. But the entire daf is on the subject of what happens when you are a makdish certain amount of money for karbanis or for shkolim, and you end up with too much money in the hektish. You didn't need to be makdish so much. What happens with the extra money? So this is a machlokas elsewhere between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai as to what you intended to do with the extra money. Generally, we'll say that Beis Hillel holds that you didn't intend to be makdish it, so it's chulin. It's regular and it's not consecrated. Beis Shammai, however, says you did intend to be makdish it, you were makdish it, and therefore it has the halachos of hektish, and you have to find something to do with it. Generally, you'll put it to a nedava, a voluntary contribution fund. Now, the first Mishnah discusses what happens if you have too many shkalim. So there's a number of different variables involved in how you are makdish it, and the Mishnah goes to it. The Mishnah says as follows: let's say you take smaller coins than a half shekel, and you collect them bit by bit over the course of the year. You know you're going to have a hard time achieving the full machzis shekel, so you collect small coins bit by bit in the fund. You hope that at the end of the year you'll have enough in the box to be able to pay off your machzis shekel obligation. So you open up the box, and it's time to pay, and lo and behold, you have significantly more than machzis shekel. What do you do with the extra? So the Mishnah says as follows: if you, when you were makdish the shkolim, you said, I'm planning on taking from these for my shekel, that means you very clearly said these are not all hektish. Some of these will become hektish. I'm setting these aside as a collection of chulin coins. I'm going to take my machzis shekel from them. There, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai agree that it's 100% a chulin. There's no problem. You take however many coins you need for the machzis shekel, the rest is chulin. Same applies if you intended to use this collection to bring a karban chatas and you ended up having too much money to bring you had more money in the box at the end than you needed to buy the karban chatas. Whatever's left, as long as you said I'm taking the money for the chatas from this collection, whatever's left is totally chulin. Not everybody agrees. The problem is when you say I'm collecting this, for this is going to be the shekel money, or you say this is going to be the chatas money. What do you say then? What's the halacha there? Now, Beis Shammai says it's certainly all hektish, whether for shekel or for chatas. Whenever you said this is going to be the chatas, whenever you said this is going to be the hektish money, whether for chatas or for shekel, it's all hektish. Whatever's left over has to be used as a donation. Now, what's used for the shekel goes into the box. The extra of what was set aside for the shekel goes into one of the boxes that was set aside for donations to the shekel fund, which you're allowed to give, and those donations are used to buy extra karbanos that are brought on the mizbeach voluntarily when there's extra time and the mizbeach is not occupied with other things. Now, whatever's left over for a chatas, you have to use that to as a voluntary karban ola or chatas fund that you will bring other karbanos from voluntarily. Now, Beis Hillel says here you have a difference between shkolim and chatas. What's left over from shkolim is chulin. What's left over from chatas, that goes to a donation fund that has to stay hektish. The Mishnah explains what's the difference. Why does Beis Shammai say that there's a difference between? Why does Beis Hillel say? That there's a difference between shkolim and chatas as far as this is concerned. So Rabbi Shimon gives an explanation. He says that the reason is because shkolim has a fixed amount. You're not allowed to give more than half a shekel. Therefore, when the person was collecting the coins bit by bit, anything which is over half a shekel, he knew wasn't going to become hektish because you can't give more than half a shekel. Chatas, however, you could give as much as you want. You could buy a big chatas, you could buy a small chatas, you could spend on multiple chatois, and therefore he had in mind that it was all going to be chatas money all along, even what ends up being extra. Now, the Gemara says that the Mishnah says that there's a Tana, Rav Yehuda, who argues in Rav Shimon. He says that reason doesn't work because you're assuming that shkolim are a fixed amount. Shkolim are not a fixed amount. You can give more than a machatzis shekel. Now, he continues explaining how, and there's a machlokas rishon on what the Mishnah means. But what he says is that you can sometimes give a machatzis shekel from larger coins. And he says that when Klal Yisrael first returned from the exile and rebuilt the second Beis Hamikdash, they used the dar coin, a Persian coin, Later they used the sela. Afterwards they used the taba, and afterwards they wanted to use a dinar, but the chachamim said a dinar is too small. And now there's a machlokes on what this means. Is it that they used these coins which are larger when there was a smaller population of Jews and they needed more people? They had to have more money because there weren't enough people giving, so they used larger coins, but when the population grew, they used smaller coins? Or is it a pshat that these were what the local denomination, the standard basic denomination that was used at the time was, and the mitzvah of machzis shekel is not necessarily to give exactly half a shekel, it's to give half of whatever the basic denomination at the time is, and as the denomination changed, the amount shrunk. Now, either way, the Mishnah says you couldn't make it less than a taba, and the Gemara will explain what all these coins are and how they relate to each other. But there's a minimum amount; it couldn't be less. Now, but what we see from here, and this is what Rav Yehuda's point is that the amount varied. It could have been bigger when there were less people, or perhaps when there was a larger base coin. It was a larger amount than the exact half shekel that was brought in the midbar. So you see that it could have been more. So your distinction between shekel and chatas, that the chatas could be larger amount than you assumed, but the shekel has to be fixed, that's not true. So the Mishnah says Rav Shimon will defend himself and he'll say, no, this is very different. The shekel is a fixed amount. That amount could vary perhaps from year to year, but every person in Klal Yisrael is bringing the same amount. So right now, whatever it is, it's fixed. It may change, but it's fixed for now. The chatas, you could bring more. It's an individual thing. You could bring more, you could bring less. It's not a problem. Okay, this concludes the Mishnah. Now, the Gemara begins by commenting on the discussion about what happens with the extra. And we've seen two general cases so far, where you collect coins and you say, I'm going to take from this collection for my chatas or for my shekel, or you say, I'm going to use these coins for my chatas or for my shekel. The Gemara now has a third case which it introduces, and the Gemara wonders what would they say here, and that's where somebody's not collecting coins bit by bit. It's not that he has a fund and he puts some small coins in the piggy bank every day to ultimately reach the amount that he needs. He has a large box of coins, he reaches in and he takes a handful of coins and he says, this is for my shekel, or this is for my chatas. So what happens now? You find more coins than you needed in the handful. You took a whole handful in one shot. So it's a machlokes amarayim. Would there be a machlokes tanaim here or not? As a matter of fact, both amarayim say there would not be a machlokes. The question is, what would everybody say? What would Beis Hillel and Meshami agree to? So according to Rabbi Yosi, everybody would agree that here the extra money is consecrated, it's hektish, and it has to be brought as an adava. The reason is because he took a handful. He knew as he took the handful that there's more here than he needed. He took a whole handful. When he's collecting bit by bit each coin that he puts in, he doesn't know where he's holding, doesn't know where he's up to. So it could be that he thought that it was hektish, and there you have a machlokes what to do with it. But where he takes a handful, he knows that it's too much, and therefore he's very clearly intending that the extras should be brought as other hektish uses. Rav Bivi says no, he knew it was too much and he didn't intend to use more than he needed. He took a whole handful and he meant whatever's in this handful that I need for the shekel or for the chatas, whatever it is, that's what I'm planning to use. So now the Gemara tries to bring two proofs to the opinion of Rav Bivi that all the extra should be chulin. The Gemara's first proof is from this Mishnah itself. In the Mishnah we saw, Rav Shimon was explaining why is it that there's a difference between shkolim and chatas. The Gemara's assumption now is that when we say there's a difference between shkolim and chatas, that shkolim the extra is chulin and chatas the extra is hektish. That's both according to Beis Hillel and according to Beis Shammai. The Gemara says, what is the case where you have Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai agreeing that there's a difference between shkolim and chatas? Let's try. If the case is where he said that I'm collecting coins and I'm going to take my shekel or chatas from this collection, that can't be this situation because there's no difference between shkolim and chatas. Everybody agrees that the extra is chulin. So it must be maybe we're talking about where he said I'm collecting these coins for shekel or for chatas. But there's only a difference according to Beis Hillel. There's no difference according to Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says all the extra is hektish there. So what is Rav Shimon referring to when he explains that there is a difference between shkalim and chatas? He must be referring to this case where you collected a whole handful, not piece by piece, and he said this whole handful is going to be for my shekel, for my chatas. There's a difference between shekel and chatas according to Beis Hillel and according to Beis Shammai, and that proves Rav Bibi's opinion that by shkalim it's always going to be chulin. Rav Bibi actually said his opinion only by shkalim. He only argued with Rav Yossi by shkalim, not by chatas. So we've proven Rav Bibi's opinion is right, that by shkalim it's going to be chulin. So Gemara says, no, not necessarily. When Rav Shimon was explaining the difference between the chatas and shkalim, he wasn't talking about Beis Shammai. He was only talking about Beis Hillel's opinion. And we're talking about the case where he collected bit by bit, and he said that these coins are going to be my shekel. There, the halacha is that Beis Shammai says that it's definitely, the X's are definitely hektish. There's nothing to discuss. Beis Hillel differentiates between shekel and chatas. Whether he was collecting for the shekel or for the chatas, and that's what Rav Shimon was explaining. Okay, the Gemara's next proof is from the Mishnah, which is coming up shortly. The Mishnah there differentiates between other karbonos and a collection for shkalim. And it says that the extras of shkalim are chulin, the extra of other karbonos are nidava, they're hektish. So the Gemara says, now this Mishnah doesn't differentiate who the Tan of the Mishnah is. That would assume that it's both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Where do you see a case in which Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai again agree that there's a difference between shkalim and chatas? We went through the cases earlier. We don't have such a case. It must be that it's in the case of where he took an entire fistful in one shot, and he said these are shkalim and these are chatas. So Gemara again says, no, this Mishnah is not Beis Shammai, it's only Beis Hillel, and Beis Hillel differentiates in the case where he said that where he collected piece by piece, and he said that these are going to be for my shekel, or these are going to be for my chatas. There is a differentiation, and it has nothing to do with Beis Shammai, and therefore you cannot prove that it's the case of where he collected an entire fistful at once. Okay, now the Gemara has a shaila in the opinion of Beis Hillel. The Gemara says, in the opinion of Beis Hillel, we say that if somebody sets aside a collection that he plans to use for shkalim, according to Beis Hillel, the extra money is going to be chulin. The Gemara understands that means that every time he puts a coin in there, it's not clear if that coin is needed for the shekel or if it's not needed for the shekel at all. If it's not needed for the shekel at all, then he's trying to consecrate to be makdish a coin which is not needed altogether. There, Beis Hillel holds if it's not needed altogether, it doesn't become hektish. Similarly, Beis Hillel would hold that if somebody thinks he's chayiv a machatzis a shekel, he didn't bring it yet this year, and he tries to be makdish a coin for machatzis a shekel, and then later he finds out that it was a mistake. So the entire consecration, the entire hektish of all these coins, or this entire machatzis a shekel that he's doing now, was all a mistake. In a situation like that, Beis Hillel would say that it's chulin, no hektish applies. The question is, what happens where he thinks he owes two and he really only owes one? So one of them is going to be hektish and one of them is not going to be hektish. What happens there? Do you say that the one that is not hektish is really not needed for hektish and therefore it's not hektish, it's chulin? Or would Beis Hillel say, in a case like this where you're being makdish two at once and one of them is needed, the other one becomes hektish as well? So Gemara says, well, we could prove this from a discussion about somebody who has to be makdish an animal for a carbon chatas. And over there, Beis Hillel holds that if somebody's makdish an animal for a chatas and he thinks he owes it, and then it comes out that he didn't really owe the chatas at all, the animal is not hektish altogether. However, if he thinks he owes two and he only owes one, and therefore he's makdish one, and he's makdish two, and one of them was really needed, the other one was not, the other one becomes hektish as well. So Gemara says, so you would think that the same thing should apply by shkalim. So Gemara says right away, what do you mean? We've already said that there's a differentiation between shkalim and chatas according to Beis Hillel. How could you learn from one to the other? Chatas has no set amount, and therefore you could assume that his extra that she's being makdish is hektish because there is no fixed amount. Shkalim, he only needs a fixed amount. Why would he bring more than that? And therefore you cannot learn from there. Alright, now the Gemara goes into the 4 coins mentioned by Rabbi Yehuda that used to be used for machatzis a shekel. The Gemara describes what they are, and they are as follows. The shekel that was used in the midbar in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu by the first machatzis a shekel, that is no longer called a shekel in the times of Chazal. That's called a selah. Half of that selah, which is what was machatzis a shekel in the midbar, is currently in the times of Chazal called a shekel. Which is, by the way, is why when Chazal refer to the machatzis a shekel, they always call it a shekel, because in their days, that amount was called an actual shekel. Now that coin size, the shekel of Chazal, which is the half shekel of the midbar, is also called a taba'ah. Half of that is called a dinar, a silver dinar, also called kesef in the Torah. So that's half of the shekel, which is really the machzis shekel, and it's a quarter of the shekel of the midbar. Now the shekel of the midbar, two of them together makes up a Persian gold coin called a darkon. And therefore, that's two selah, two shekel of the midbar, which is two machzis shekel that we need to give. These are the coins that were mentioned by Rav Yehuda. The darkon is also called a dinar zahav, a golden dinar. This is not the same as the dinar zahav, which is mentioned elsewhere around Shas, which was worth 25 silver dinar. Here, as you can tell by doing the math, this would be only 8 silver dinar, because the darkon is 2 selah, the selah is 2 shekel or taba, and the taba and shekel are 2 silver dinar. These is the coinage that were involved over here. Now, the Gemara has noted that in the Mishnah it says that the Chachamim would not accept using a dinar for machzis shekel. The Gemara says that's because it couldn't go less than the machzis shekel of the midbar, which was 2 dinar, which was a taba. The Gemara says that the source for that was a pasuk that says, it says in Nehemiah, it says, "Vehebmadnu aleinu mitzvahs laseis," and it says, "Shlishis hashekel bashana aveidas beis elokeinu." That they cannot give less than a third of a shekel. Now, some Rishonim understand this to mean that when it says a third of a shekel, it means a third of a darkon, which comes out to 2/3 of the shekel of the midbar, which is therefore more than the half a shekel of the midbar. What happened was that Nehemiah made a minimum. He said you cannot ever give less than this, no matter what the denomination of the coins are, and therefore it has to be at least 2/3. Now, why 2/3? It should be half. So he increased it a little. He added a little bit that it should be at least 2/3, but it cannot be less than that. Now, the Gemara has other ways of explaining this pasuk that says Shlishis hashekel bashana. So Gemara says Shlishis hashekel possibly means that you're supposed to give 3 times a year. You're supposed to give shkalim, and this does not necessarily mean for the Beis Hamikdash. 3 times a year you should give tzedakah to aniyim of at least half a shekel each time. Gemara has another explanation of this pasuk, which is very similar, that the tzibur should not be asked to give more than 3 times a year. And the Gemara's fourth explanation is that when they took the money out of the boxes in the Beis Hamikdash for machzis shekel to buy karbanos, they did it in 3s. There were 3 boxes, each box held 3 saw, and they made this withdrawal 3 times a year. Okay, the Gemara now moves on to explain how we came up with the, not how we came up with it, but how the amount of machzis shekel was derived. Why do Klal Yisrael have to give machzis shekel? So this is Agada, and the Gemara gives 4 explanations. The Gemara says, well, the machzis shekel was to atone for the chet ha'egel, the sin of the golden calf, which took place at the midday, in the middle of the day. It was at chatzos. Since it was half the day, they have to give half a shekel. The Gemara gives another very similar explanation. The Gemara says it was the 6th hour of the day, therefore they should give 6 coins called garmisin. That was small coins at the time. 6 garmisin are equal to half a shekel. The Gemara's third explanation is based on the sale of Yosef. Yosef was sold for 20 kesef. 20 kesef is 20 dinar. Now there were 10 brothers who sold him. That means each brother got 2 dinar from the sale. 2 dinar is equal to half a shekel of the midbar, and that's where that number came up. Now the Gemara also says that there's another halacha that's based on the sale, and that is when a person redeems his firstborn son, he has to redeem him for 5 slim. A selah is 4 dinar. A selah is 2 taba, and a taba is 2 dinar. And therefore, since the sale was for 20 dinar, you have to give that amount to redeem your firstborn son. 5 slim is equal to 20 dinar, because it's 4 dinar per selah, and that is the source for that halacha. Now we begin our next Mishnah. The Mishnah teaches what happens if somebody sets aside money to buy karbanos or other hektish things, and there is money left over. Again, so the Mishnah begins by again discussing shkalim. This is the opinion of Beis Hillel, and says that if you have extra money left over from what you collected over time to use for Machzis HaShekel, the extra money is chulin. Now, if you have karbanos, you are collecting money to buy karbanos, such as a carbon mincha, including the asiris ha'efa, or other obligatory karbanos, like the ones brought by zavim, zavos, yoldos, a carbon chatas, a carbon asham. Any of these things, the extra money has to go for nidava. It has to go for voluntary offerings, voluntary karbanos. You have to put them in a separate fund and buy other karbanos with it. You cannot, it's not chulin, and you can't use it for extra obligatory karbanos. It's got to be in this special fund. Now, anything which you set aside to buy karbanos nidava, things which were anyway only voluntary, they were only donations, so you could use the money to buy more donations. It doesn't have to go to a special fund for the Kaitz HaMizbeach, for the Kaitz HaMizbeach. It could be set aside to buy more. So if you set aside money to buy a carbon shlamim, you could buy more shlamims. Money to buy a carbon mincha, you could buy more minchas. Money to buy an oila, you could buy more oilas. The reason that this is different is because these aren't obligations. You can bring them whenever you want. And therefore, when you set them aside as for whatever carbon you plan to use it for, you could still use it for that. You just bring another one. Now, what if somebody has extra money that he set aside to buy his carbon Pesach? So the halacha is that extra of a carbon Pesach is a shlamim. You should use it to buy a voluntary shlamim, carbon shlamim donation. Now, what about a nazir? A nazir has to bring three types of karbanos. There's an ola, there's a chatus, there's a shlamim, and there's a bunch of breads, loaves of bread that he has to bring. So there was a fund set up for poor nazirim who could not afford it. That fund, if it was collected for a particular ani, then you could use it for other aniyim. If there was anything left, you could use it for other aniyim, because the fund was meant to pay for poor nazirim. No problem to use it for whichever ones you want. If, however, one particular nazir set aside a fund for himself, then this has the status of an obligatory obligation carbon, and if he has leftover funds, he has to use it to go to the mizbeach, to the fund of karbanos used when the mizbeach is empty as well. Okay, the Gemara begins here. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yosi says, I heard when I was in Bavel, I heard of Yehuda asking Shmuel, what is Allah if somebody sets aside his machzis HaShekel and then he dies and he never uses that machzis HaShekel? Shmuel answered, it goes to the fund. It goes to the fund of karbanos that will be used for when the mizbeach is empty, just like everything else. Now, what if somebody sets aside money to buy a carbon mincha, asiris ha'efa? Now he's particularly referring to the mincha that the Kohen Gadol brought every day, a minchas chavitin. So the answer here is that it's a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Yochanan says that this money has to be destroyed. If there's extra money set aside for that, it has to be destroyed. You cannot use it to buy other karbanos. It's only set aside for this carbon mincha, and it cannot be used for tomorrow. It has to be new money tomorrow. Therefore, this money has no use. Got to be thrown in the Yam HaMelech. Rabbi Lazar says, no, you could use it for the karbanos nidava. So Gemara says, if you look at our Mishnah is clearly like Rabbi Lazar. It says that if you have a carbon mincha, money set aside for carbon mincha for the asiris ha'efa, and you have extra, you use it for the nidava fund. So why does Rabbi Yochanan say it has to be thrown in the Yam HaMelech? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan says that's talking about other types of minchas. It's not talking about the mincha of the Kohen Gadol. That's talking about the mincha that a very poor person brings. He has to bring a carbon chatos, and he can't afford it. He could bring a minchas chatos. But the mincha brought every day by the Kohen Gadol, that is different halacha. It cannot be replaced, and therefore it has to be thrown out. The money has to be destroyed. Gemara moves on and asks, we had seen in the Mishnah that a carbon Pesach that has extra funds that's not used, or the halacha is also true that any carbon Pesach animal which is not actually brought as a carbon Pesach itself, any extra psachim issues, all become a shlamim. They revert to a shlamim. The Gemara asks, how do you know that? So the Gemara says, in the pasuk that's describing carbon shlamim, it says, V'im min hatzayin carbonay lezevach shlamim la'Hashem. And it says, it's describing shlamim, and it says, im min hatzayin carbonai. So from there we learn that this shlamim is something which is from tzayin. Another carbon which is tzayin becomes this shlamim. That's what the pasuk means when it says, im min hatzayin carbonai. It's referring to a carbon which is tzayin, so that becomes a zevach shlamim. Now what's tzayin? Tzayin refers to sheep or goats. So this refers to a carbon pesach which comes from sheep or goats. So Gemara says, how do you know? Maybe it's a carbon oila. Carbon oila could also be sheep or goats. The Gemara says a carbon oila could also be a cow. We want something which is only sheep or goats. The Gemara says, okay, well, what about an asham? An asham could also be sheep. The Gemara says asham. Asham can only be sheep, can't be goats. We're looking for something that can be sheep or goats, and that's only a carbon pesach. That could turn into a carbon shlamim. The Gemara asks, where do you learn that from? From the word min? The extra word min there includes sheep and goats. It's got to be something which could be sheep and a goat. But you usually use the word min to exclude things. The Gemara says no. It's not from the word min. It's from the word. It's from the extra letter hey in had sign. That's where including it has to be something which could be a sheep and a goat. The word min is an exclusion. It's excluding, since we're learning that the pasuk is referring to carbon pesach. It's excluding things that carbon pesach can be. It can't be older than a year, and it can't be a female. It has to be a male sheep or goat. Now, had we said that it was a carbon asham, we could have also understood the word min. So the word min doesn't really help us here. Had we said it was a carbon asham, it would have been excluding the goats. But either way, the word min is not what we're learning from. The word min fits no matter which carbon we're referring to. It's the extra hey that we are deriving this from. So now the Gemara says, alright, so you're telling me that you know that carbon pesach reverts to being a shlamim when it's not used, because of the fact that the pasuk describing shlamim says iminat tzayin karbonai, but there's a pasuk about a carbon oila that also says iminat tzayin karbonai, so maybe it should revert to being an oila. Maybe describing an oila, it says that you're bringing a tzayin karbonai, you're referring to a carbon pesach which is not being used. So Gemara says, no. If we have to turn a carbon pesach into something, we'll turn it into something that it's similar to. Either into a carbon shlamim, because both shlamim and pesachim are eaten, not into a carbon oila which is not eaten by any human, or to something which is kachim kalim, lighter kachim, lighter karbanas, lighter levels of kedusha. That applies to pesachim, and shlamim are both lighter, as opposed to carbon oila which is kachim. The Gemara now introduces a machlokes between Rabbi Chanina and the Chachamim, and Rabbi Yechanan holds like Rabbi Chanina, about the subject of how exactly the carbon pesach that's in the wrong time or that's not used, how does it change to a shlamim? According to the Chachamim, you have to have in mind when you're shechting the carbon that you're doing this as a shlamim. If you do not have in mind to change it to a shlamim, it stays a carbon pesach and it's possible because it's in the wrong time. Or if you have in mind you want to change it to a different carbon besides a shlamim, it also doesn't become a shlamim, and then it's a puzzle carbon for whatever reason, even if it's a carbon pesach, it's in the wrong time and it has a psul. So Gemara says, where does Rabbi Yechanan argue? Rabbi Yechanan and Rabbi Chanina say, no, you don't have to have in mind, it reverts to a shlamim automatically. Even if you don't have in mind to be a shlamim, it's a shlamim automatically. So Gemara says, how does he know that? What's the source? It's from the pasuk imatzoin karbonai. It continues and it says lezevach shlamim. That means that when it's as we said earlier, this is referring to a carbon pesach which is in the wrong time, and it says that it's lezevach. It's any carbon. Doesn't matter what carbon you make it into. It's automatically shlamim. I mean, atzayin karbonai lezevach. You take this carbon pesach and you make it lezevach. Any type of carbon, it's automatically l'shlamim. It's going to be a shlamim no matter what you do to it. So Gemara says, so we have a question. According to this opinion, what happens if you change it to a shlamim, but with a psul? You have in mind that it should be a shlamim, but with a psul. You have in mind, let's say, the wrong time. You have in mind to do one of the avodos tomorrow instead of today. That's a wrong kavana, and that's a psul in the carbon. So the Gemara says, who cares? Whether you change it to a shlamim and it's puzzle, or it stays as a carbon pesach because your intent to make it into a shlamim, whatever it is, it's a puzzle carbon anyway. Either it's a carbon pesach and it stays a carbon pesach and it's puzzle because it's in the wrong time, or you successfully change it to a shlamim, but it's with a machshavas psul, so it has a psul. So what's the difference? The Gemara says very simply, because if you change it to a shlamim successfully and it has a psul, then it's pigul, and pigul, if you eat it, you chayav kares. However, if it was not successful changing it to a shlamim, it's not pigul, because the halacha is that in order for something to become pigul, the pigul has to be the only psul involved. Pigul is if you have the kavanah to do the avod in the wrong time or the wrong place. If you have a different psul involved, like if it's a carbon pesach and it's wrong time, then there's no pigul that falls on this carbon, and you will not be chayav kares for eating it. The Gemara leaves the question unresolved. The Gemara now has one final shaila. We know that if you shechted carbon pesach in the wrong time, so if you shechted l'shem carbon pesach or you shechted stam, and we're holding that counts as a carbon pesach, then it's puzzle because it's a wrong time. If you shechted l'shem shlamim, or according to the ones that it's stam and it works for shlamim, then you're machshir it because it can't be a Pesach now, but it could be a shlamim. The Gemara is now working with the opinion that if you shechted stam, it's a carbon Pesach, and if you shechted l'shem shlamim, then it becomes a shlamim and it's kosher. So the Gemara asks, what happens if you have two kavanas in the same shechita? It's not Erev Pesach, it's the wrong time. You start off shechting l'shem Pesach, and then afterwards you switch to l'shem shlamim. Does the kosher l'shem shlamim uproot the pasul l'shem Pesach and make the entire carbon kosher or not? So Gemara says, we have a statement in Maseches Pesachim where it's clear that if you start off stam, and that stam is pasul, and then you finish off l'shem shlamim and that's kosher, that's okay. So why should this be worse? Stam here counts as l'shem Pesach. They're both pasul. The stam and l'shem Pesach are both pasul. And just like stam and then you end off shlamim is kosher, so l'shem Pesach and then you end off shlamim should be kosher as well. So Gemara says, if that's true, so the same thing should be if at the time you did the shechita you had in mind that you're going to do the zrika, the throwing of the blood, another avoda. You're going to do that l'shem the wrong thing. It's the same thing. You're doing the shechita in the wrong time. You're doing the l'shem Pesach and that's pasul. But the zrika you're having in mind, you're going to do l'shem shlamim. That would make the carbon kosher because it's not supposed to be a Pesach now. It's supposed to be a shlamim. So would that be enough to be machshir? It should be, but we know that it's not. So Gemara says, why are you comparing the two? Two avodas, you cannot say that one changes the other. If you're within one avoda and you change, you first have das for Pesach and then das for shlamim, you uproot the das for Pesach when you have das for shlamim. But your avoda of your zrika, what you had in mind when you're going to throw the blood, that's not going to uproot what you had in mind when you did the shechita, and therefore it doesn't change it, and it remains a carbon Pesach and remains with it.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.